Now, I know I've talked about this numerous times, but I now have evidence I'm going to show you here on the screen so you guys can kind of have an idea of what I've been trying to talk about. Now, I know a lot of folks, from John Campia to a close online friend of mine in Canada, Zara Nizarak. Everybody, including myself, have gone back and forth with them when it comes to, what is seen in a higher format, basically. Like, nowadays, you have people that have mostly 4K televisions in their home, or a 4K Blu-ray device, player in their home, or maybe even if they're lucky enough to have one and afford one, an 8K player or 8K television, and possibly with an 8K player, but more than likely a 4K player along with it. And a lot of people have always said that the argument coming around with mostly these 4K devices, and sometimes 8K, but mostly 4K, is the fact that when you play a regular, let's say on a UHD Blu-ray player connected to a 4K television, that most times when you play let's say a regular DVD disc that could be mainly 480 to 720 in format, basically 480p to 720p in format, that it should be that basically that should be the only image you get, even if you play it on a 4K television, and even through courtesy of a 4K Ultra Blu-ray player. But that's not necessarily true, because nowadays, I should say, most of the 4K Blu-ray players you get and most of the 4K televisions you get are smart devices. Just like, some of the 720s and 1080p televisions are smart. The same with the regular Blu-ray players, are smart as well, because they have to incorporate other services in them, like apps and everything, streaming, apps or music apps and stuff like that, or internet. Most of them are smart devices. And by being a smart device, they're able to detect what kind of devices connected to them, basically. For example, with a smart 4K device, it's able to detect, okay, do I have a 720 device connected to me, or do I have a 1080p device connected to me? And most time it will register a 1080p device. Like I have a DVD player in here that I could put DVDs on, but the only problem is the audio won't come in for some reason. The picture will come in, but not the audio. I do not know why. Mostly I think it's because it's 720, but it does register it as 1080p to 720 to 1080p. There's no getting around that. But that's not the point as to why I want to show you these images here. You see, both of these images are off me recently putting in the second disc of the Popeyes 75th 2-disc anniversary set that VCI had released over a decade ago. And when I placed this into my UHD Blu-ray player, which is connected to my 4K television, both smart devices, I want you to look at what the display says on both. On the 4K television, it shows you that it's playing at the 4K picture frame, basically at the 3480, 2160, 60 frames per second frame rate, or image, if you will. And then when you look at the Blu-ray's display, it tells you what disc it is. It's a DVD video, but oh look, it says it's playing at 4K 60 frames per second. Now, you would think that a DVD housing potentially a 480 picture should be saying something along the lines of 480p, right, or 720. That's not the case, because the selling point of this, through all the manufacturers that came up, that have been developing and manufacturing these devices, these televisions and these Blu-ray players, the selling point is that no matter what disc you put in there, whether it's a DVD, whether it's a Blu-ray, it's going to up the picture to 4K quality. That's what it does. It's going to up the picture to 4K quality. Now, I know a lot of people might say that's impossible. What about regular television? That's a good question, because regular television, especially with a smart device or a smart 4K device, it will register the image at 1920 by 1080 60 frames per second. So in other words, it will acknowledge that yes, the channel you are watching, the device you are watching it on, is broadcasting it in 1920 by 1080 at 60 frames per second. Nothing higher. But you're watching it though on a 4K television, which basically means that even though the picture you're watching is 1920 by 1080, basically it's a 1920 by 1080 picture that, as they would say on YouTube with their stats, is times 2. And when you look up the times 2.00 and you put it alongside the 1080 and then alongside the 1920 by 1080p, and you have the asterisk 2.00 next to it, that asterisk 2.00 next to the 1920 by 1080p is YouTube's way, and in a sense, a broadcast cable way of saying you're watching the picture in 4K, even though it's 1080, even though the picture itself is 1080 or 720 or whatever, you're watching it in 4K, in a 4K image. I know that sounded probably a little confusing and confusing and convoluted and ramblish, but the point that I'm getting at is this: yes, a 4K smart TV or even an 8K smart TV will register the fact that your broadcast signal you're getting is at 1920 by 1080. But if you look at YouTube, here, when you look at an image, and let's say you're playing a 4K video, yes, it will tell you that the current optical resolution you're watching is 3480 by 2160. But that the viewport, the frames, if you will, are 1920 by 1080 dash, 2.00, which means you're watching it in 4K. For example, this video you're going to be watching, it's going to be uploaded in 1920 by 1080 at 60 frames per second. That's going to be its average format. But because of the fact that I'd be watching it, on a 4K television, it's going to have that times 2.00 next to it, due to the fact that it's saying that you're watching it in 4K, even though the format is lesser than 4K. It's up the image by 2 times, its original format. And that's basically what broadcast television, cable television, the image you're getting. Like, let's say if you're watching the NLCS right now, which is currently on, or you're watching the ALCS on your 4K television, and it's a smart television, which, like I said, most are. Basically, it's going to say, when you go to the display, it's going to say 1920 by, 1080, 60 frames per second. But that 60 frames is as equivalent as to, let's say, a 2.00, which basically means that 60 frames per second, that 60p, that's telling you, yeah, you're watching this in 4K, even though the display were telling you that it's being broadcast in, the signal that they're getting it from is 1080. And that's the truth. That is the truth. A good example, again, going back to my Blu-ray player connected to my 4K television, both are 4K devices. A good example is when I would put in a burned DVD that I would burn using the Windows software. Basically, when I would play it on there, it would tell me that it's at 4K. The Blu-ray device, that is, would tell me that it's at 4K 60 frames per second, or it might say it's at 4K 30 frames per second, depending on what kind of video I burned and what kind of resolution, pixel wise, that I wanted to put it at, depending on the software I would use. Or if I'm watching a regular, let's say I'm watching a regular DVD like this will say 4K, but it might say 24 LP, or it might say 4K slash 24p, or it might say 4K slash 30p. But most times DVDs, are displayed at 4K 60 frames per second. Because what the device is doing, ladies and gentlemen, is it, like I said earlier, it's upping the ante. It's upping the quality. It's not basically remastering and upgrading your disc. No, it's just taking the signal from the 4K UHD Blu-ray device, sending it to its fellow 4K smart TV television device, and saying, hey, we have a 480p or 720p disc here that we need to upgrade to 4K quality. I mean, in other words, I'll make it simple. You take a regular DVD or Blu-ray and you put it on a regular Blu-ray connected to a regular television, or a regular DVD connected to a regular television, and guess what? You'll get the image as it's meant to be, and it will tell you that it's that image. But what the 4Ks are doing, and again, as I mentioned earlier, the selling point all the manufacturers and even the retailers have had about these devices is it ups the image. It ups the picture. It adds 2 times the pixels to the image. Thus, instead of my 4K Blu-ray device telling me in the display, oh, you're watching a 720 at 30 frames per second, instead it will tell me that the image that should be 720 at 30 frames per second, or 40p or 480p image at 24 frames per second, instead of telling me that, it'll tell me it's playing and being displayed at 4K resolution, or being displayed in 4K resolution at 60 frames per second. The same with the television, because it's being played off a 4K device. And again, I know that sounded convoluted and a little rambleish like I mentioned earlier, but the point I'm trying to get across is when you look at these images here, basically these two images, are basically evidence of the fact that, it doesn't matter what kind of disc you have. If it's not, what I'm trying to say is it doesn't matter what kind of disc you have, if it's not a UHD disc, if it's not a UHD Blu-ray disc, it doesn't matter whether you recorded something on a DVD recorder or burned something on a, with a burning software or whatever. When you put it into a 4K Ultra Blu-ray device connected to a 4K television, it's going to display at 4K, no matter what, because the image is being upped. It's not being remastered. It's not being, it's not being remastered, basically, what I'm trying to say. It's basically being upgraded temporarily. It's being upgraded so that you see more of the image. And if it's something like an animation, as you'll probably see in these images, if your television or even your Blu-ray device gives you the option to go HDR, you'll get to see more of what that image is like, because it's showing you what the image was meant to look like in a brighter setting, if you will. But yeah, basically what I'm trying to get at, folks, is we can argue all we want about whether or not something is meant to be seen in 4K, something is meant to be seen in 480, 720, 1080. The fact of the matter is this: if you own a 4K television, smart or not, mostly a smart one, because that's what's being sold out there, and you have it connected to a 4K UHD Blu-ray device, then it will register any disc you put in there at 4K. That's what it will do. It will register any disc you put in there at 4K and at certain frames that it has. If it's a DVD disc, most of the time it will register it at 4K 60 frames per second. But there are times it will go and say 4K 30 frames per second, depending on how the video or the picture that's on the DVD was filmed. Basically, what bit rate or frame rate it was filmed at or animated at. And the same goes for regular Blu-ray. You could put a Blu-ray in there that's meant to be 1080p, 1440p at the most, and it will register and be displayed at 4K, maybe 30 frames per second or 24 frames per second, maybe even 60 if you're lucky, because all it's doing is upping the image. That's it. it's upping the image. It's giving you more pixels. Thus, you're watching mainly what is regularly, let's say, a 1080p picture or movie or show from your Blu-ray disc, or that's on your Blu-ray disc. You're watching it in 4K. You're watching it showcased in 4K. The same, like I said, with DVD. If the DVD, which has been mostly sold when it came out to be an easier way to watch in higher quality at the time it came out, 480 to 720p images on your television, then you're not going to be watching them at 720 or 480p. It's not going to display that. It's going to display them being showcased at 4K and mostly at 60 frames per second. And that's it. But I thought I'd just come on here and, along with these images, kind of give you an idea of what I've been trying to talk about the whole time. Give you a bit of clearer, even though I know this one sounded very ramble-ish and all that, I do apologize, but more of a clearer, as I check something here, clearer idea of what I was talking about when it comes to, basically, my hand hit the mic there, I do apologize, but give you a better and clearer idea of what I was talking about when I would say, and especially to those like John Campea and Zara Nizarek, give you guys a better idea of what I'm talking about when I say that the image on a DVD disc, whether it's an officially bought disc, a recorded disc, burnt disc, whatever, same with Blu-ray, that most times when you put it into your UHD Blu-ray player, and that player is connected to your 4K television, which both should be a smart device, because most of them are nowadays, that mainly they will display the picture at 4K 60 frames per second. That's for DVD, or 4K at maybe 30 frames, 24 frames, or even 60 frames per second when it comes to Blu-ray. So hopefully that cleared things up. And again, as I mentioned, if it's a regular broadcast television, yes, it will acknowledge that it's being shown or being broadcast in 1080p, but you gotta note that 60p right next to the 1080p. That's pretty much, that's pretty much their way of saying, yeah, it's a 1080p broadcast, but it's being, and it's being broadcast that way to your television, but that 60 frames per second is in a way telling you that you're watching it in 4K. Hey, that even though it's a 1080p broadcast, you're watching it on a 4K television, thus it's being shown at 30 frames more than maybe what is being broadcast on a regular 1080p. Just saying. But again, hopefully this helped you guys out. I know it may have sounded a little bit more confusing than usual, but let me know what your thoughts are. Comment down below, live chat during the premiere, like the video. Check out my Vimeo at BW Roses. Check me out at Patreon and BW Roses. BW Roses discussions on all your favorite podcast locations, as well as check me out at Venmo to help donate to the channel if you want to do that as well. So until next time, guys, I'll talk to you later.